The giant oak stood as a silent guardian over the clearing, its roots twisting deep into the earth. Propped against its massive trunk lay a slab of river-worn bark, wide enough to serve as a wall for the forest creatures. Bouncy arrived first, his feet hitting the moss with a rhythmic patter. He skidded to a halt, his gaze tracing the rough, weathered grain of the wood. It was a blank slate, vast and intimidating. Luna followed, moving with a quiet, measured grace. She stopped beside him, her head tilted as she looked up at the top edge of the bark, which reached well above their heads. The air here was cool, smelling of damp earth and ancient wood. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of what they intended to create. Bouncy shifted his weight, his eyes darting across the surface, mapping out invisible lines and shapes. Luna remained perfectly still, her focus locked on the texture of the wood. Bouncy turned his attention to the base of the tree, where he had gathered his supplies. He pushed aside a pile of dry leaves to reveal a collection of flat stones, each serving as a palette. On them sat mounds of crushed berry pigments, vibrant and raw. The red was deep, like autumn leaves, while the yellow was bright, reminiscent of the morning sun. A small pile of blue petals lay nearby, waiting to be ground into a fine paste. Bouncy picked up a twig brush, its bristles stiff and coarse. He dipped it into the red pigment, swirling it until the color coated the wood. He tapped the brush against the stone, listening to the soft, rhythmic thud. The scent of crushed fruit rose into the air, sharp and sweet, mixing with the damp smell of the forest. Luna stepped closer, her nose twitching as she inspected the pigments. She nudged a small pile of green moss toward the center, testing its texture against her pad. Bouncy watched her, then added a drop of dew from a nearby leaf to thin the red paint. He stirred it with the tip of his brush, watching the color bleed and deepen. The stones were stained with streaks of color, a messy map of their intent. Every tool was in place. The pigments were ready, waiting to be transferred to the bark. Bouncy looked at the brush, then at the vast, empty surface of the wood, his grip tightening. The stillness of the forest did not reach Bouncy. His tail flicked with a life of its own, a rhythmic, nervous pulse that betrayed his need for motion. He paced the small patch of moss before the bark, his claws clicking against the hard earth. He would stop, pivot, and then resume his frantic circuit, his eyes constantly darting from the pigments to the vast, empty wood. Every few seconds he would reach out to adjust a brush or nudge a stone, his movements sharp and hurried. Luna, by contrast, was a study in absolute calm. She sat at the edge of the clearing, her paws tucked neatly beneath her, her posture as steady as the oak tree itself. She watched the world with slow, deliberate blinks, her focus entirely inward. While Bouncy vibrated with the urge to start, Luna seemed to be waiting. For the exact moment the light hit the bark just right. She did not fidget, she did not pace. She simply existed in the space, a quiet anchor to Bouncy's storm. The contrast was stark. One was a blur of kinetic energy, ready to strike at the canvas. The other was a statue of patience, absorbing the environment before committing to a single action. The air between them hummed with this difference, the silent friction that defined their partnership. The pacing stopped. Bouncy stood before the towering piece of river-worn bark, his chest heaving with the sudden stillness. He reached for the twig brush, his grip firm, and dipped it deep into the mound of red pigment. The wood of the brush felt cool against his palm. He did not hesitate. He lunged forward, the tip of the brush meeting the rough, weathered surface of the bark with a sharp, audible drag. He pulled the brush upward, then sharply to the right, carving a jagged, uneven line that pulsed with the intensity of his movement. The red pigment clung to the grooves of the wood, thick and vibrant against the dull brown background. He did not pause to admire the stroke. He immediately swung the brush back, the bristles spraying tiny droplets of red onto the surrounding moss. His movements were directed, sharp, and frantic. He attacked the bark as if the color were a physical weight he needed to shed. He was no longer waiting, he was painting. Bouncy did not slow. The brush became an extension of his frantic pulse, dancing in quick, erratic arcs that defied any sense of order. He dipped and slashed, the rhythm accelerating until his arm was a blur of motion. He worked without looking at the overall composition, focused only on the immediate need to fill the void. Bold, messy shapes began to dominate the surface, overlapping in thick, unrefined layers. A heavy splash of ochre collided with a streak of violet, creating a muddy collision of color. He pivoted on his hind legs, reaching high to drag a long, jagged line across the upper edge, then dropped low to scrawl a series of frantic circles. Within minutes, a full third of the bark was consumed by this aggressive, swirling energy. He ignored the drips running down the wood, ignored the way his own fur was becoming splattered with pigment, and ignored the silence of the clearing. He was driven by a singular, mounting pressure. The bark was now a chaotic landscape of raw, unblended color. He stood back for a heartbeat, chest heaving, before diving in again. Bouncy finally froze, his brush hovering midair, dripping a single glob of red onto the ground. He looked toward the base of the oak. Luna had not moved. She sat with her paws tucked neatly beneath her, a statue of quiet intention. Before her lay a small, curated pile of crushed pigments, distinct from the mess Bouncy had created. She held a single blue petal between her claws, turning it slowly to catch the filtered light. She did not rush. She leaned forward, pressing the petal against a patch of green moss to test the depth of the shade. The contrast was absolute. Where Bouncy had left a trail of jagged, overlapping scars on the bark, Luna sought harmony. She tapped the petal against the moss, then pulled it back, tilting her head as she observed the way the color interacted. She was not trying to conquer the surface. She was listening to it. She placed the petal down, adjusted its angle by a fraction. Bouncy watched her, his tail twitching in a sharp, irregular rhythm. The stillness of the clearing, once peaceful, now felt like a weight pressing against his chest. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the dry leaves beneath him crunching with every nervous movement. He tapped his foot against the gnarled roots of the oak, a rapid, insistent beat that echoed his internal clock. He looked at the bark, then back at Luna, who remained motionless. The gap between his frantic pace and her deliberate care was widening. He could not stand the silence any longer. He turned back to the pigments, his movements jagged and forceful. He grabbed a handful of yellow, his claws digging into the crushed material, and slammed it onto the bark. He began to smear the color in wide, rough circles, dragging his palm through the pigment to force a sun into existence. His frustration was no longer just a feeling. It was etched into the bark in thick, uneven streaks of sun-bright color, a visual scream against the quiet. Bouncy stood back, his chest heaving as he stared at the chaotic smear of yellow he had just forced onto the bark. The silence of the forest felt like a suffocating blanket, and his own pulse hammered against his ribs. He looked down at Luna. She was still sitting there, completely unmoved by the urgency that was tearing through his nerves. The sun was visibly shifting, casting longer, thinner shadows across the mossy floor, and the light they needed was slipping away. Bouncy felt a hot, sharp prickle of irritation rise in his throat. He could not wait for her to find the perfect angle. He took a jagged step toward her, his tail lashing behind him like a whip. "Hurry up, Luna!" he chirped, his voice sharp and demanding. The sound was too loud, too sudden. He did not wait for a response, his eyes darting back to the unfinished painting, his impatience now a raw, exposed nerve. The sharp command hung in the air, vibrating against the bark. Luna did not move at first. She remained anchored to the moss, her body stiffening as if struck. Slowly, her ears began to flatten, pressing tight against her head until they were nearly invisible. She pulled her front paw back from the painting, the movement jerky and uncoordinated. She tucked it deep under her chin, curling her body into a tight, defensive ball. Her whiskers, usually twitching with curiosity, now trembled in a rapid, rhythmic tremor. She stared fixedly at the dirt between her feet, refusing to look up. The light around them seemed to dim. She did not blink. She simply existed in the tightening circle of her own stillness. Bouncy looked at the bark. His own marks were jagged, dark, and rushed, a chaotic blur of colors that clashed against the natural grain of the wood. He shifted his gaze to the space beside him. Luna remained motionless, a small, still point in the clearing. The space on the bark where she should have been working was empty, a stark, pale patch of wood that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. Bouncy tapped his foot against the roots, but the sound was thin and hollow, failing to break the stillness. He looked at his brush, then back at the painting, then at the ground. The air between them had thickened. It was no longer the light, airy atmosphere of a shared project. It was dense, heavy, and pressurized. He could hear the rustle of a distant leaf, but it sounded miles away. The silence was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight that pressed down on his shoulders, forcing him to acknowledge the space he had created. He stood frozen, his tail still, watching the shadows lengthen across the clearing. The unfinished painting loomed before them, a testament to the rhythm he had broken. Bouncy felt the wood of the brush handle digging into his palm. His grip was white-knuckled, a remnant of the frantic pace he had forced upon the morning. He looked at the bark again. The jagged, aggressive lines he had carved into the surface stood out like scars against the natural texture of the wood. Beside him, the silence was absolute. He watched the way the light caught the edge of the brush, a tool that had become a weapon of his own impatience. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that no longer matched the stillness of the forest. He looked at his own trembling fingers, then at the empty, untouched space where Luna should have been adding her own color. The realization arrived not as a thought, but as a physical tightening in his chest. He could not keep moving like this. He could not keep tearing through the work while the world around him went cold. With a sudden, sharp intake of breath, he opened his hand. The brush slipped from his grasp. It hit the mossy ground with a dull, muffled thud, rolling once before coming to a complete stop. The frantic energy that had driven his limbs for hours evaporated, leaving his hands empty and his shoulders slumped. He stared at the discarded tool. The brush lay abandoned in the moss, a silent marker of the pace he had finally abandoned. Bouncy turned away from the bark. The painting, with its jagged, uneven lines, was no longer the center of his world. He lowered his body, pressing his weight into the soft earth, and began to crawl. The ground was cool beneath his palms, damp with the morning dew that still clung to the roots of the giant oak. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his eyes fixed on the small, still figure ahead. Every inch he covered felt like a bridge being rebuilt. He did not look back at the work. He did not look at the sun that continued its slow climb through the canopy. He steered his path until he reached the space directly in front of Luna. He sat up, planting his feet firmly in the dirt, and positioned himself as a barrier. He was now the only thing in her line of sight, effectively cutting off her view of the unfinished, chaotic project behind him. He held his position, his breathing slowing to match the stillness of the clearing. He waited, his focus narrowing down to the space between them. Bouncy sat motionless, a solid wall between Luna and the chaotic bark behind him. He watched the tremor in her whiskers, the way her ears remained pinned flat against her skull. She did not blink. She did not shift her weight. She was a statue carved from fear, waiting for the next shout that never came. Bouncy lifted his right paw. He held it suspended in the air for a heartbeat, measuring the distance, testing the tension in his own muscles. He moved slowly, eliminating any sudden jerk that might startle her further. His paw descended, not with force, but with a deliberate, feather-light pressure. He extended his toes and made contact with the soft fur of her shoulder. The touch was warm, steady, and undeniable. It was an anchor dropped into her panic. For a second, nothing happened. The forest held its breath. Then, the reaction traveled through her small frame. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. The rigid line of her spine softened. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into the pressure. The silence in the clearing deepened, no longer heavy with tension, but expectant. Bouncy did not withdraw his paw. He leaned forward, closing the final inches of space until his breath stirred the fur near her ear. He spoke, his voice a low, raspy vibration that barely carried beyond the two of them. "I am sorry," he whispered. The words were simple, stripped of the frantic energy that had defined his earlier outbursts. He held her gaze. refusing to look back at the bark or the scattered pigments that had caused the rift. "I was only looking at the finish line," he continued, his tone steadying as he spoke the truth aloud. "I was so focused on the end of the work that I forgot about the art we were making together." He felt the warmth of her shoulder beneath his touch. He did not rush the next breath. He allowed the confession to hang in the air, a quiet admission that prioritized their connection over the completion of the project. He watched her face, searching for any sign of change. Bouncy watched her, his breath held tight in his chest. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt like a void. It was a space waiting to be filled. Luna remained still for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dirt between her paws. Then, the glassy, unfocused look in her eyes began to shift. She blinked, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to clear away the remnants of the morning's hurt. Her whiskers, which had been trembling, finally grew still. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting his directly. There was no anger there, only a quiet, searching clarity. She did not speak, but she moved. With a gentle, precise motion, she reached out with one paw and nudged a small, fragrant pile of crushed blue flowers toward him. The petals were soft, their color vibrant against the dark earth. It was a simple, wordless invitation to begin again. Bouncy watched the flowers slide across the ground until they rested against his own toes. The gesture was a bridge, a silent declaration that the rift had been closed. He felt the tightness in his own chest loosen, a physical release that mirrored the change in her posture. She had accepted the apology without needing a single additional word. The air in the clearing felt lighter, the tension replaced by a fragile, budding sense of peace. He looked from the blue petals up to her face, acknowledging the gift with a soft, steady nod. Bouncy looked down at the blue petals, then back at the painting. His tail gave a sudden, involuntary flick, hitting the dirt with a sharp sound. He felt the familiar pull of urgency, the old itch to finish, to move, to conquer the bark. He saw his own paws twitching, ready to grab the brush and dash. He caught himself. He pressed his palms flat against the earth, grounding his energy into the soil. He closed his eyes, focusing entirely on the air entering his lungs. He took a long, deep, measured breath, feeling the oxygen fill his chest, and then slowly, steadily, release. He concentrated on his tail, forcing the muscles to relax until it lay still against the moss. The frantic vibration that had defined his every movement began to ebb away. He felt his heart rate drop, matching the slow, rhythmic pulse of the forest around them. He did not look at the sun or the remaining space on the bark. He looked only at the present moment. He was no longer a creature of speed, but one of intention. The restlessness was now replaced by a cold, clear focus. He opened his eyes, the frantic light gone, replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. He was ready to start again, not with speed, but with care. Bouncy reached out, his movements now fluid and measured. He bypassed the dried, crusty brushes he had used earlier and selected a fresh one, its bristles soft and clean. He held the handle lightly, his grip no longer white-knuckled with haste. He turned toward the small pile of green pigment he had prepared. He lowered the brush tip into the soft, earthy paste, watching as the green coated the bristles. He did not swirl it. He did not jab. He lifted the brush and brought it toward the bark. His hand hovered for a heartbeat, testing the space. Then, he touched the wood. He began to pull the brush across the surface, moving with a steady, unwavering pressure. The green line emerged, thick and deliberate, tracing the curve of a leaf he had previously ignored. He felt the resistance of the wood grain against the bristles, a sensation he had been too rushed to notice before. He kept his eyes locked on the tip of the brush, matching the speed of his hand to the steady, calm rhythm he had observed in Luna. He did not look at the sun. The stroke was long, graceful, and perfectly controlled. He lifted the brush away, leaving a clean, intentional mark that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic mess. Bouncy watched Luna. She did not rush. She pressed a single blue petal onto the bark, smoothing it with the tip of her claw. Her movements as steady as the turning of the earth. Bouncy felt the old, frantic rhythm rising in his chest. A sharp, buzzing energy that demanded he move faster, finish sooner, and cover more ground. He took a breath, held it, and let it go. He forced his hand to mirror hers. He placed his own color beside her blue petal, applying the pigment with a slow, deliberate stroke. Luna looked up, her eyes meeting his, and she dipped her brush into the yellow. They began to work in a shared cadence. When Bouncy felt the urge to dash ahead, he looked at Luna's steady hands and slowed his own. They moved together, a quiet, rhythmic dance of color and intent. The bark became a canvas for their mutual focus. He watched her patterns, she watched his, and they adjusted their pressure to match. He was no longer racing against the sun, he was simply painting. The bark began to change. Where jagged, erratic lines had once dominated, a new structure emerged. Bouncy and Luna worked in silence, their movements precise and calculated. They focused on the base of the painting, layering deep browns and mossy greens to build the forest floor. Bouncy used the side of his brush to create the rough texture of fallen leaves, while Luna pressed small, crushed berries into the bark. They stopped for a moment, pulling back to observe their progress. The chaotic mess of the earlier hours had vanished. Every stroke now served a purpose. They added shadows beneath the painted roots, giving the surface a sense of depth. Bouncy reached for a darker pigment, carefully outlining the shape of a fern, while Luna filled in the gaps with soft, earthy tones. The forest floor was complete, a solid foundation for the rest of the scene they were creating together. With the forest floor established, they turned their attention to the empty space above. Bouncy reached for a deep, heavy violet, but Luna tapped his wrist with her paw, shaking her head. She nudged a pale, airy blue toward him instead. He understood. He dipped his brush into the lighter shade, swirling it with a touch of white. They began to sweep the colors across the upper reaches of the bark. Bouncy moved in long, sweeping arcs, while Luna followed with shorter, delicate dabs that added depth to the clouds. The pigments blended seamlessly, the harsh lines of the past giving way to a soft, expansive horizon. They worked without hesitation. Bouncy felt the weight of his earlier frustration vanish entirely, replaced by the calm focus of the task. They layered the sky with streaks of pale gold and soft lavender, capturing the transition of light as the afternoon deepened. The painting now breathed with a sense of openness and scale. Every stroke was a testament to their newfound patience. They stood side by side, watching the colors settle, the harmony of their work reflecting the quiet, steady connection that had grown between them. The landscape was complete, a vibrant stage waiting for its final touch. Bouncy looked at the empty space near the center of the bark, his brush hovering in the air. He felt a sudden hesitation, unsure how to capture the bond they had forged. Luna stood up and walked to the base of the painted oak tree. She dipped her paw into a mixture of soft brown and white, then pressed it firmly against the surface. She looked back at Bouncy, her gaze steady and inviting. He followed her lead, dipping his own brush into the same pigment. Together, they began to outline two small figures standing side by side. Bouncy painted a nimble, upright shape, while Luna added the soft, rounded silhouette of a kitten beside it. They worked with deliberate care, refining the edges until the forms were clear. Bouncy added a small, bushy tail to the squirrel, and Luna used the tip of her claw to define the kitten's ears. They were no longer just painting a forest, they were painting their own presence within it. The final shapes were set, but the surface still held the raw, distinct textures of individual effort. Bouncy and Luna moved in tandem, their brushes and paws working to soften the boundaries between the figures and the forest floor. They blended the edges of the squirrel and the kitten into the mossy base, using light, feathery strokes to make the subjects feel anchored in the scene. Bouncy carefully thinned the pigment on his brush, layering a translucent wash over the entire bark to pull the disparate colors into a singular, cohesive tone. Luna followed, using her tail to gently buff the surface, smoothing out the thickest deposits of berry juice and flower petals. The chaotic energy that had defined the start of their project was gone. Replaced by a deliberate, rhythmic grace, they worked in silence, their eyes tracking the way the colors now bled into one another, creating a depth that hadn't been there before. Every harsh line was softened. The masterpiece was complete. They looked at the bark, then at each other, acknowledging the stillness that now defined their shared creation. The work was finished, but the clearing was not yet done with them. High above, the sun began its final descent, sliding behind the distant canopy. As it dipped toward the horizon, the harsh daylight softened into a deep, liquid gold. This new light reached into the clearing, stretching long shadows across the forest floor and climbing the trunk of the giant oak. It struck the surface of the bark, catching the ridges of the dried berry pigments and the delicate edges of the crushed petals. The painting responded instantly. The colors, which had seemed muted in the shade, now ignited with a faint inner radiance. The yellow sun they had smeared earlier shimmered as if it were truly burning, and the green, mossy floor took on a rich, velvet depth. Bouncy and Luna watched as the golden glow transformed their creation into something that felt alive. The light shifted again, turning from gold to a bruised, twilight purple, casting the entire scene in a magical, ethereal haze. Every stroke they had made, every layer they had patiently applied, now caught the fading rays in a different way. They moved in unison, taking 3 slow steps backward to distance themselves from the bark. From this vantage point, the painting shifted once more. The individual strokes and the layered pigments merged into a singular, cohesive image that seemed to vibrate with the remaining twilight. Bouncy tilted his head, his eyes tracing the flow of the forest floor they had created, then moving upward to the sky. Luna followed his gaze, her posture relaxed, her focus fixed on the way their 2 figures stood side by side in the center of the composition. The realization of what they had built together settled into the space between them. It was not just the colors or the shapes, but the rhythm of their cooperation that made the image resonate. They stood in the quiet clearing, the air cooling around them, and watched the painting hold its own against the encroaching dark. Every brush mark and petal placement now served a purpose, contributing to a whole that was far greater than the sum of their individual efforts. They remained still, letting the silence of the forest confirm the success of their work. The painting glowed, a testament to their patience and the steady, deliberate pace they had finally mastered. The temperature in the clearing dropped as the last of the light vanished. A gentle breeze stirred the high branches of the oak, sending a soft rustle through the leaves that echoed in the quiet space. Bouncy shifted his weight, his attention moving from the glowing bark to the small figure standing beside him. He took a step closer, closing the gap that had remained between them throughout the day. He moved with deliberate care, reaching out to draw Luna into a tighter circle. He wrapped his tail around her, the movement slow and steady, pulling her firmly against his side. The contact was immediate and grounding. Luna leaned into the pressure, her presence solid and warm against him. This was not a moment for words or further movement. It was a moment to anchor themselves in the success of their day. They stood together, shielded by the curve of his tail, watching the deep blues of the evening sky settle over the forest. The air grew crisp, but the space they occupied remained shielded and still. The painting stood as a silent witness to their patience, its colors dimming as the stars began to pierce the canopy above. The canopy above thinned, revealing the first pinpricks of light in the darkening expanse. One by one, the stars emerged, casting a faint silver glow that settled upon the surface of the bark. The painting, which had seemed so vibrant in the twilight, now took on a different quality under the starlight. The colors deepened, the textures of the crushed petals and pigments becoming subtle shadows that shifted with the flickering light of the night. Bouncy and Luna remained motionless, their combined weight pressing against the gnarled roots of the oak. The painting stood firm, propped securely against the wood, serving as a silent testament to the hours they had spent laboring together. It was no longer just a collection of marks. It was a record of their patience and the rhythm they had found in one another. They watched the sky, the vastness of the night contrasting with the small, sheltered space they had created at the base of the tree. The air grew still, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, leaving them in a pocket of profound quiet. They did not move, content to let the night deepen around them, their shared work resting nearby. The forest floor absorbed the remaining warmth of the day, leaving the clearing in a state of absolute, heavy calm. Every rustle of the high canopy ceased, and the distant calls of the night birds faded into the dark. The silence was not empty. It was a thick velvet presence that wrapped around the base of the oak. Bouncy and Luna sat in the center of this quiet, their breathing synchronized with the slow pulse of the woods. The world beyond the clearing had vanished, replaced by the stillness of the night. There was no need for movement or speech. The tension that had defined their earlier work had dissolved entirely, replaced by a deep, resonant peace. They leaned into one another, feeling the steady, grounded weight of the other against the rough bark of the tree. The air remained cool and still, holding them in a private, protected space. The silence was broken only by the low, steady vibration of a purr. It rose from the base of the oak, a rhythmic, grounding hum that seemed to sync with the slow, deep pulse of the forest. Above them, the leaves caught a sudden, faint draft of air, shivering with a soft, dry rustle that rippled through the branches. The sound was like a lullaby, constant and soothing, weaving through the dark. Bouncy leaned his head against the solid wood of the tree, his breathing matching the pace of the purring beside him. The world felt vast, yet perfectly contained within the small circle of their shared space. Every element, the cooling air, the faint scent of earth, the steady vibration of the kitten, and the gentle movement of the canopy fell into a singular, unbroken rhythm. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to say. The painting rested against the oak, a silent witness to the patience they had learned. The forest held them in its quiet embrace, the night deepening around them until the boundaries between the trees, the ground, and the two friends seemed to blur into one. They remained there, anchored in the stillness, existing in a state of profound and lasting harmony as the night air settled over the clearing.